Sienna, is, what do you hope people take away from this?
I think the series deals with some really intense subject matter and some really current issues that the world is finally thinking about in terms of consent and what is consent, and holding people in privileged positions accountable for their behavior. What does that entitlement look like? I think that the show is made in a really clever way. It doesn't spoon feed any answers. I think people might finish it and have different opinions about what actually happened. And I hope, therefore, that there's lots of debate and interesting conversations. I think it's a jumping off point for things that should be being thought about. So that's sort of it. That's what I hope for. And of course, they had fun and binged it and were moved and all of those things that we try to make with everything.
And laughed and no, not that
not
one.
That much
not
laughter,
that one.
no.
I was curious because by the end, I wasn't entirely sure if James understood, do you think he understood he was guilty of rape, or do you think he was still unaware of the consequences?
It's a good question. And it's something we deliberately, S.J. Clarkson, the director, and I kind of worked on as a note of ambiguity to maybe further stoke the kind of conversations that Sienna was hoping people would have, where, yeah, you may be rooting for the guy at some points, and at other points determinedly sure that he should, is guilty. And the idea that someone is kind of so entitled that they possibly are unable to question themselves is a very interesting launch pad for discussion.
I thought it was very fascinating how during certain testimony, she said, I was drinking a glass of champagne, but then when he was discussing it, she was, drinking beer. And it brought up a lot of questions about like memory. At least for me, in hindsight, you think that something was consensual, but feelings change. Sienna, what did you think of that decision to kind of, I guess, make it, questionable?
I think that Sophie, my character, has a really interesting line. And she talks about the blurriness of consent and how sometimes maybe it was just easier to acquiesce. Does that make us culpable? Like, how have I contributed to these men feeling like they could take what they wanted with impunity, without any consciousness, really? I think that in the case of Olivia Lytton's character and James, it's really complicated to prosecute rape. It's very difficult for women to speak up about sexual abuse. And the show really, really lays it out in all of its ugliness and everybody's different perspectives and memories. And like Rupert said, I think James is convinced of his innocence. It's a staggeringly blinkered perspective on the world. But Sophie realizes that she sort of allowed certain behaviors. She didn't question little things that probably contributed to him feeling like he could just walk through the world and take what he wanted when he wanted to. And so she goes on this really interesting journey of self-flagellation and self-discovery, and she's sort of learning the way the world has changed. It was different for girls my age when I was growing up than it is for girls today. And thank goodness we're having those conversations, and that the word no is becoming part of the language, because it didn't used to be that way. I think we're making progress, but a long way to go.
Rupert, I think it's fascinating that your character is a politician, and I think that he uses like his intelligence to almost convince Olivia that he takes her more seriously. Do you think that played a role in their dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, one of the sort of themes of our show is the abuse of power. And she works not only for him, but under him in a very junior position. And whether or not she's bright, which she clearly is, she hasn't got the experience that he has. So, and I remember finding it very kind of cold, actually, when he kind of breaks up with her, because she's so kind of wide-eyed and innocent about the whole thing, and he seems to think it's foregone, that it's going to be over. And so there clearly is a completely differing set of views on the relationship that they had. And I think that's another thing about a relationship that is quote unquote casual. Normally one person is way more into it than the other person, and that's often where the problems arise, because there isn't a transparency about that.
I think it will start conversation, and I think that's really important. It feels like one of those shows that kind of is left with the audience sort of, wondering what they would do in a situation that is similar, or you know, if they were the jury, how would they respond and to this case that is put before them? It feels like a show that will definitely create, you know, good conversation.
Michelle, I was curious, you play the prosecutor, of course, and throughout the trial, we see these like conflicting memories, you know, a glass of champagne in one hand and, you know, a glass of beer in another. What do you hope people see throughout that? You know, it's not a defense, I would assume, saying that, you know, memory is blurry.
Yeah, I think the show explores that a lot. I think, you know, in how memory is so, it's so conflicting from one person's perspective to another. And I love those moments, actually, you know, in that moment between you guys when, you know, when did the glass smash? Is she holding champagne? Is she drinking? You know, and of course that continues on to the incident itself, where from his perspective, it is entirely different to hers. And for a prosecutor, it is, you know, that is the objective really, is to get the jury to believe as much as possible your client's side of the story, and to hone in on that as much as possible, without faltering. So there is a sort of rehearsed element to it with a client.
For women who watch this, I mean, for myself, I personally related to both of you in the sense that you look back on these experiences and it's change, you know, memories change, feelings change. And, you know, what do you hope people like me take away from this?
I think this show will, I hope that this show creates conversation and more awareness of how difficult these cases are to prosecute. And, you know, this, we don't have enough time, but the statistics are sort of shock, you know, to me, when I first started working on the show, I was shocked at some of those statistics. And it's, you know, it's a line that Kate says in the show, that assaulting your wife is, you know, that wasn't considered illegal and since sort of 1991. And, you know, for me, that was really shocking that wasn't that long ago. So I think it will perhaps, you know, educate as well. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I'd like to think that the court case as well, like Michelle said about the audience becoming the jury, asking questions of ourselves. Why are we reacting the way we're reacting to what we're seeing? Why does it make us believe or not believe? Things like, for example, when Olivia says, I still loved him, that because the air gets taken out of the room as if she said something so damaging to her case. And then you step away from that, and it's about asking, as a society, if the jury is a microcosm of society, for example, it's like it's all of us, and it's kind of that question of why does that make her more unreliable? You know, why does the fact that she didn't report it to the police instantly make her more unreliable? If anything, if you look at statistics on people going through trauma and that shock period and many reasons why someone wouldn't instantly come forward, if anything, it makes her part of the majority. If anything, that should, you know, strengthen her case. So I would like to think that those court cases can just ask some questions on how we react to what we see and we hear, and what that kind of that thought process, and just and that's all of us, you know, and that's everyone. So that's, yeah, I hope that too.